Hello, I'm Kate Gerbeau. Welcome to Sitrep, your weekly look at the big issues in defence and world affairs. From order book to the front line, the UK has struggled for decades to get vital equipment to its troops on time and within multi-billion pound budgets. So we talked to the Defence Procurement Minister James Cartlidge about the latest shake-up to the system, which MPs have branded broken, but which he insists can be fixed.
There are many Legion stories of our armed forces going back over the years when they found themselves in theatre with kit that let them down, and that's the sort of thing that keeps me awake at night.
Also on Sitrep, we check in on construction progress for the Royal Navy's next generation of submarine hunting frigates.
I think the submarine commanders of the submarines we're wanting to hold at risk are going to respect the capability of this ship. She's got long legs.
Plus,
God save the King.
why are French troops singing our national anthem in Paris while Coldstream Guards stand on duty at the French presidential palace?
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
So we're talking defence procurement and acquisition this week, and let's be honest, it's not a subject that many people find exciting. But Mike, it really matters, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And I was just thinking, in the last quarter century, since 1998, I've watched defence procurement go in a complete circle of reform until we're now back where we started in 1998, trying to do it all a bit better. And it does matter terribly because, there's always been an unspoken assumption behind all this, that now that we're moving back to war fighting as a prevailing assumption of our defence policy rather than expeditionary operations, we've actually got until about 2030 to get it right. But we haven't got until about 2030. We now know we're in a very dark period of European and world politics, and we've got to get it right now. So it matters more than any other time in my lifetime that we finally tried to get a grip on this most perennial of all defence problems.
And we've discussed many times before, over many years, many examples of getting defence procurement wrong. Ajax, Nimrod, aircraft carriers, all late and way over budget. Projects sometimes abandoned altogether. No surprise that MPs have called the MOD's procurement system broken. But ministers say they have a new plan to fix it. The most significant change is a move to spiral development of equipment. It means an end to the concepts of initial and full operating capability. Instead, troops will use new hardware when it meets a minimum deployable capability, and it will then be improved with extras over time. So will this really deliver servicemen and women the equipment they need when they need it? James Cartlidge is the Defence Procurement Minister.
Well, of course, time is crucial. We want to procure equipment much more quickly. Actually, we've done brilliantly procuring for Ukraine because there's been that sense of urgency because it really is a live military theatre, obviously. But with Spiral, this is about cultural change. And if the assumption is, instead of we're going to get this exquisite item, which gets full operating capability in many years and it's highly technical, instead we're going to go for what we call the minimum deployable product into the front line as soon as possible, i.e. being usable once the balloon goes up, something that could be used, dare I say it, in war. If you get it to that stage, it may not be perfect, but you're then spirally upgrading it. Because actually that's how technology works. This is not a new concept if you run a software business, and much of our competitive edge in the future will come from software.
When you talk about the minimal deployable capability, is there a danger then that people might get equipment that isn't fully ready for the job?
Well,
how do you prevent that from happening?
If you think about it, that is a psychological change, because what you're saying is you're immediately making the emphasis on let's get this into use as soon as possible, because essentially we are, unfortunately, potentially closer to a wartime situation. Now, if we as the UK were formally in conflict, as all our personnel will remember, you have urgent operational requirements, you have things that you do to ensure that where you're going out to Afghanistan or Iraq, etc., your equipment is more battle ready than it would be in a normal peacetime situation. So how do you use that sort of sense of urgency where we are as a country now? And I think it's by, as I say, trying to get this cultural change and making people realise that technology is on our side. It is working faster. It's normal for software companies to upgrade their programs quickly. If we can get that culture into our DNA in defence, we will have better procurement, but more importantly, our armed forces will be more capable and more competitive.
You also put an emphasis on exportability for new acquisitions. Does that not risk equipping our armed forces based not on what they think they need, but what other countries want?
Well, this is common. I mean, probably two of the best examples, France and Israel. These are nations which have always strongly considered export when they procure. And the reason for that is, if you go back to the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, N-law was remarkably effective. Of course, we then got the request, can we obtain more of these items? And they weren't being manufactured anymore. So what export gives you, it gives you industrial resilience, because your demand is stronger, because the UK demand isn't enough for industry on its own. But also, it means if we can get enough export and UK demand and Ukraine and put all that together, you can get the ideal scenario for industry, which is what we call always on. The machine is chugging along so that if you need to ramp up production, you can. Recent years, that's been a real problem. Production went down so much because we thought we had peace. We now know we're in a different era.
Ultimately, this is about giving Britain's servicemen and women the equipment that they need to do their jobs. What commitment do you give to them about delivering that equipment with this new system?
Well, this is what motivates me and my colleagues here in Defence. It's what motivates people at DNS, at Defence Digital. We know we have a huge responsibility. There are many Legion stories of our armed forces going back over the years when they found themselves in theatre with kit that let them down. And that's the sort of thing that keeps me awake at night. But I have huge faith in British industry to deliver, as long as we have a close partnership and as long as we're prepared to be open and transparent.
You said it's the kind of thing that keeps you awake at night, worrying about servicemen and women not having the equipment they need. When will this new system really start making a difference to those men and women doing their work, risking their lives at the sharp end?
So I'm confident that we'll be announcing some new procurements quite soon that will exemplify some of the principles I've outlined.
Care to share?
Obviously, being the Ministry of Defence, some of these are sensitive. Some of them will be announced shortly. And when they do, I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest from our armed forces personnel. But my message to them is we want to deliver the best. It's not straightforward. It's highly complex. And there will still be, no matter what happens, those long programs like nuclear submarines, etc., which take a long time and are highly complex. But we know that technological change is possible because it's happening in Ukraine in front of our eyes. We've actually empowered some of that. Let's learn those lessons so that we improve our own armed forces and our own procurement system.
Having said that, we know that getting new military equipment is generally a long-term job, but your boss, the Defence Secretary, says we are in a pre-war era. What are we doing to speed up acquisition of things we might need very urgently, simple things like artillery shells, for example?
Well, that is an excellent question, because I think, as sort of building on the point I just made, if you look at some of the public discussion, people will say, well, we need to buy more ships, and that's fine, and they have to understand, frigates, no matter how hard you try, no matter how good the procurement system, will take a significant amount of time to build. Whereas actually, we have our existing fleet. We have the ships that will be coming out of our amazing shipbuilding yards in Scotland in the next few years, our Type 26, Type 31, etc. What can we do to enhance both the lethality and survivability of our existing platforms and capabilities, the ones we would fight with today, and the stuff that will be coming out imminently, rather than 9 or 10 years' time? That's where I think we need to focus.
The Commons Defence Committee says we're not ready for war. So does James Heapy, who was Armed Forces Minister until last month. As Procurement Minister, what are the most urgent tasks to get us ready for that possibility?
So first of all, just to reassure everyone, I think we are ready. What James Heapy, who was a brilliant Armed Forces Minister, was actually talking about was national planning. So if you like, cross-government planning in the event of like a full-scale threat to the homeland. And that's a big deal. But if you look at the reality, first of all, we have a continuous sea deterrent. We committed 20,000 personnel. Many people watching this, I hope, will be on Steadfast Defender or will have been on it recently. That is the biggest contribution to that NATO exercise. It's a massive exercise. It shows the readiness of NATO, which we are a key part of. So I think we are ready. Of course, the other part of it, as you say, procurement. You look at what we're procuring in the land domain, Challenger 3, Ajax, Boxer, these are all coming through now. Our Type 26 frigates, our Type 31s, and of course, as I said, the enhancements to our existing equipment, and then there's GCAP, there's the upgrades to Typhoon, F-35s. I think we have a formidable force, actually, but I'm very conscious of the fact that it constantly needs that support and maintenance and constant improvements to procurement.
A phrase we've heard a lot over the years is this conspiracy of optimism. If you forgive me, you do sound pretty optimistic to me in buying defence equipment, particularly about the costs as well. How does your new model address that?
So, by the way, I am optimistic because when I look at what the UK is doing, it punches way above its weight. They have great faith in our personnel. They themselves haven't always had great faith in procurement, so I get that. What I'm trying to say to them is, I think I'm being as open as I can, as candid as I can about the mistakes we've had in the past and learning from them. I am not promising it will all now be perfect, obviously, but I think those core principles are really important. Let's just take the first one, being more joined up. That's pretty significant. We have a strong culture in the UK Armed Forces of 3 single services, the Army, the Air Force and the Navy, and long may that remain. But in the modern battle space, you have to have an integrated force. And so I think there is a realisation that that must come with it, integrated procurement.
The Defence Procurement Minister James Cartlidge. There is much more to his plan to fix defence acquisition. There's a new integration design authority in Strategic Command designed to stop competition between the single services, which has just started work. Also, an emphasis on exportability. But will that prioritise what other countries want over what our forces think they need? You can watch the whole of our conversation on the Forces News YouTube channel or listen in an extra edition of the Sitrep podcast. Mike, what are your takeaways from what James Cartlidge had to say there?
Yes, I was thinking, that if the Defence Procurement Organisation could manufacture one enormous silver bullet and shoot themselves in the head with it, they would. But they can't, because there is no silver bullet for all of this. And what the Minister was talking about, of course, was trying to do a bit of everything that the system has been trying to do for a long time. But he's saying that we're doing it now in a different mindset. He talked at the very beginning about cultural change, because we can see how well the system can work over aid to Ukraine, over UORs, the urgent operational requirements. So it can be done if there is a sense of national urgency. And really what he's saying is, well, we've injected that sense of national urgency into doing what we normally do. And this idea of spiral development is quite important, that instead of delivering what Nick Horton, when he was Chief of Defence Staff, said was exquisite technologies, instead of waiting for exquisite technologies, and the Minister made that point, it's exquisite. Well, you don't want exquisite, you want workable. And the most important thing is it may not be exquisite, but it's there. It's with the boys and girls on the front line. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, and on that note, that big change, no more initial and full operating capability, what did those mean in practice?
That means getting stuff out there as soon as it's reached a level where it can be used. And the development will take place, if necessary, during a combat phase. That's exactly what happened during the Second World War, of course. The equipment was there on the front line, and partly it worked and partly it didn't. And immediate improvements were made as we were on the hoof. Now, in peacetime, you don't want that. For all sorts of reasons. But in wartime, or in times of stressed operations, the most important thing is that the basic equipment is there. And what the MOD now talks about is the 80% solution. If you can get 80% of the requirement, then that's okay. Because they used to say, and I've heard chiefs of procurement say this over and over again, because they wanted to get to 95%, you'd spend so much money getting the system up from 92% to 95%. Those last few percentage points of performance were so expensive and so time consuming. Strip that out. Take it to the front line with 80%. Take the risks. Some people will suffer because of it, but more people will be saved because they've actually got numbers of deployable, usable systems on the front line.
So what are the risks in moving from that model to a single concept of minimum deployable capability?
Well, we don't know because it's very context specific. So if it's a risk of deterrence, if you're sending stuff, say, to the Baltic states to deter, let's say, a Russian invasion, if that were the scenario, then in a way the risk is not so great because the Russians won't know if it works properly. Our people will know it works pretty well. But if you're sending stuff into a fighting war, say if there were a deployment to Southern Europe or the Gulf again for some reason, then the risk is higher, because, as some proponents of high technology say, that in certain areas there's no prizes for coming second. And I've heard this a lot in naval circles. They say you need exquisite technology in naval warfare because you can lose a ship, you can lose a whole ship's company because somebody has a 5% technology advantage over you in the systems they're using, in the missiles they're using. So it's always a balance of risks depending on the context in which these things are going to be deployed.
If it does come down to pressure and expediency, and culture change, do you think this really is perhaps the moment where it can be done?
Yes, it can be. And I mean, James Cartlidge is right. The urgent operational requirement system worked extremely well in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in a way, I mean, that was what the Second World War was all about. It was everything we had in the Second World War was urgent operational requirements. They saw a requirement, they found some way of meeting it, and they met it with tremendous inventiveness. The problem with UORs is that if you do everything through UORs, you end up with no control over the budget. You end up with no overarching sense of where the force are shaping themselves. And as James Cartlidge said, we're moving into an era where you've got to be combined. You've got to be able to use weapon systems and backup systems across different domains of warfare. And the problem with UORs, because they're very focused on what you need this month, next month in one particular theatre, that you end up with a sort of ragbag set of equipment if you're not careful, and not much control over the budget. So although UORs are very useful, you can't base the whole system on it unless, as in the Second World War, we are fighting for our lives in a global conflict.
Well, one of the big acquisition projects that the Defence Procurement Minister is grappling with is the Royal Navy's new Type 26 frigates. They'll replace the Type 23s as the UK's submarine hunters. Sitrep's Dave Sivills-McCann has been assessing progress on a visit to see construction work on HMS Cardiff.
When you see these ships up close, you get a real sense of the scale of them, especially when they're right in the heart of Glasgow on hard standing. You can see the distinctive radar tower even before you enter the yard, and despite some plastic covering to shelter the workers from the Glasgow elements, from the outside she looks ready to head out to sea. A lot of the fabrication work has been done. We got to enter the ship, and you really do get a sense of the scale when you're climbing up the 7 flights of stairs up to the deck. While the ship from the outside is really taking shape, there's still a lot of work to be done in the interior. The corridors are pretty much made up of bare steel with chop markings used to help with the fabrication, and structure and wires and plastic pipes are sort of hanging from the ceiling. There's still a lot of work to be done. It kind of reminds you if you're remodelling a house, it's really been stripped back to the bare bones, and that's kind of how the ship looks at the moment.
So Cardiff is still bare bones, as you say, but pretty much a complete skeleton then. What's that like to see?
Well, it's still the bare bones. You do get a sense of the layout of the ship. We were taken round. We saw that what will be the senior rates mess, where the tables and chairs will one sit. There are 2 rows of computers and a whiteboard where the daily morning meetings for the workforce take place. That seems to be their sort of hub every morning. We were taken to the mission bay, which is still covered in scaffolding. We're told there's an extra 10 feet above us that we couldn't see because of all that scaffolding. That's where the ship will house the boats for amphibious operations, equipment like water making facilities, and humanitarian aid for disaster relief. That we didn't really get a sense of the scale of that, but we were told it would be pretty impressive when we see it, but it's not quite so filled with working material. We were also taken to the ship's gearbox. I mean, that's been fitted, and the attention to detail on these vessels, even the pipes have been fitted with sort of rubber brackets to make sure the noise from the fluids going through them won't be detected by submarines. So there's really attention to detail on this. Her sister ship, though, HMS Glasgow, is a little bit further down the line of construction. She's already being fitted out. We were told the vessel's about 65% complete, with even a crew of 20 Royal Navy personnel on board, writing the operations manual and getting acquainted with the new class of ship.
So a year and a half ago, we were told the Type 26 programmes were about 12 months behind schedule. The delay blamed on COVID. How is it all going now?
Well, the delay is still being felt. A couple of factors, one being COVID, although the work did continue as the project was seen as a matter of national security. The workforce did have to adhere to social distancing and COVID regulations, which did affect productivity. We were also told there's also a skills shortage in the shipbuilding industry, as there are in a lot of sectors at the moment. We're told that Brexit was one of the contributing factors of that, what the company believes. But BAE Systems Managing Director of Naval Ships, Sir Simon Lister, told me that they're working hard to get these vessels ready for service.
We're making good progress, David. We're well on with the prototype ship, HMS Glasgow. She's down in Scotstoun fitting out now, and we're expecting to get her to sea in 26. As a submariner, I know just how tricky this ship is going to be to deal with in future. I think the submarine commanders of the submarines we're wanting to hold at risk are going to respect the capability of this ship. She's got long legs, and she can go in harm's way and look after herself and her crew.
You've told us some of the attention to detail, some of the little features that are going to be on board this ship.
We've made sure that all the equipment is as quiet as it possibly can be, and that it's mounted in a way that makes the ship as stealthy as it can be. And then, away from the operational capability, the living accommodation, the standards of the facilities on board are really the best they've been in any warship we've built.
But BAE Systems is hopeful of making up time on Ship 4 HMS Birmingham, and the company is confident there won't be any delays in the second batch of ships that have begun construction. The first steel was cut on HMS Birmingham last year, and HMS Belfast, the third class of the Type 26, is already underway. And with all shipbuilding processes, the speed of the build does get quicker after the first in class.
We heard from the Defence Procurement Minister about his desire to make equipment more exportable and buy in a way that makes defence industry more resilient. Does the Type 26 order fit that mould?
Very much so. These vessels have proven to be quite popular, even for hitting the waves. Australia's has already ordered 6 of what its Navy is going to call the Hunter class, and Canada has ordered 15 to replace their Halifax class fleet. This full order book for BAE Systems is helping the company invest about £300 million into their yards on the Clyde, a new academy to train the next generation of shipbuilders in Scotstoun, but also a £200 million covered building hall that can accommodate 2 frigates at a time. And this will protect the ships and the workforce from the Glasgow elements during the build, and should make them more straightforward as well as quicker and cheaper.
David Sivills-McCann, good to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mike, how important are the Type 26s and how urgently do we need them?
Yes, they are important, and we need them now. They're important because they're part of the force structure. So the Type 45 destroyers are the air defence element, and we've got 6 of those, although 3 of them are in refit at the moment. Those are the Daring class destroyers, so that's air defence. And then the Type 26s are anti-submarine warfare, and we're due to have 13 of them, or to keep 13 of them, which would be 8 Type 26s and 5 Type 31s, which is a slightly more cut down version of the 26. The 26 is the top of the range, and the 31, with an eye to export, it is said, is going to be a slightly more cheap and cheerful is the wrong word, but you know what I mean, a slightly lesser high-tech version of the 26. And their anti-submarine warfare capabilities are absolutely critical, because undersea warfare is now in a high state of development, and the best type of anti-submarine warfare frigate is required. The danger always, of course, is that frigates are also the workhorses of the Navy. So you may HMS Richmond, for instance, who was on anti-aircraft or air defence patrols in the Gulf, replacing HMS Diamond in the Red Sea. That had been sort of not downgraded, but it had been made into more of a general purpose frigate. And so although it could do the job that Diamond was doing, it was having to improvise to do it. It wasn't exactly the right ship. They certainly did a good job, but it's typical of what happens to frigates, that they get used for lots of different things. And the idea that we have 19 frigates and destroyers is more or less fixed in the arrangement. There's a possibility of some more. But I can remember when we were told that 32 frigates and destroyers was the absolute minimum required for the proper defence of the United Kingdom. Now we seem to regard something less than 20 as acceptable. But of course, any sailor will tell you, and any First Sea Lord will tell you, you never have enough frigates. And the first person who used to make that argument was Nelson. There are never, ever enough frigates for the Navy.
Now, more than a week since an Israeli airstrike killed 7 aid workers, the diplomatic and political reverberations continue. President Biden has called the killings outrageous. Israel's government maintains it was a grave accident and has sacked a colonel and a major from the Israeli Defense Forces for what it calls a serious failure. Perhaps the one thing everyone can agree on is that this shouldn't have happened. The aid workers had shared their travel plans, which were authorized by Israel's military authorities. The process is called deconfliction, and it's essential in any conflict, not only to protect civilians, but also your own forces and prevent unintended escalation. It's well known to many who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, but how does it work and how reliable is it? Professor Julian Richards spent 20 years working in intelligence and security for the UK government and is now director of the Centre for Security and Intelligence Studies at Buckingham University.
The original concept of deconfliction was actually primarily aimed at avoiding force-on-force clashes in a theatre of war. So, and particularly in situations involving air campaigns where there's a lot of fast-moving aircraft and munitions flying about. There's two issues. One is that you end up accidentally attacking your own forces on the ground or in the air. The other is if you've got complex campaigns, which sadly is increasingly the case as we look around the world in recent years. So if notably the Syrian conflict, for example, where you had a number of different actors involved, you had the US in the air and involved at some stages, the UK, the Russians, in some cases striking or targeting the same targets, in some cases aiming at different targets depending on who they were aligned with. So deconfliction was primarily a set of mechanisms to keep each other informed about where certain assets were at given times so that they didn't end up shooting each other down, because the consequences of that would be very serious. Now, in more recent times, there's a thing called humanitarian deconfliction, which is more about humanitarian actors on the ground, aid workers or health workers, avoiding being hit by military actors. And that's the very regrettable case that we've seen in Gaza recently has really brought that to the fore.
And you mentioned the mechanisms for preventing this. Can you just talk us through them? How can troops on the ground or people targeting from the sky know that a set of people or vehicles are friendly or not a threat?
There are a couple of mechanisms. The original Geneva Conventions that paved the way for actors such as the Red Cross and Red Crescent and other health-related humanitarian actors. And at that time, the basic mechanism was clear marking of assets on the ground. So the Red Cross insignia and the Red Crescent and Red Diamond, and ideally white-coloured vehicles or buildings on the ground. Now, in more recent times, more electronic mechanisms are used, and particularly GPS coordination. So in a complex conflict, what will usually happen is that the humanitarian actors on the ground who wish to move into a particular area will make arrangements with the state military actors in the area to share GPS details of assets on the ground. And the state military is supposed to factor those into their communications and to try and avoid those targets.
And if we could just go back to the mechanisms and those markings on vehicles, they can be abused though, can't they? Does anyone really trust them?
Well, yes, now that is a problem. So again, one of the features of more contemporary conflict is the complicated mixture of actors involved. So going back, a few decades, it was primarily state militaries and civilians on the ground. As we know these days, there will be a number of NGOs doing various things on the ground, and also a number of non-state or sub-state actors who, and that's complicated for two reasons. So one is that technically a non-state actor is not a signatory to the treaties and conventions because they're not a state per se. The treaties and conventions do try and factor that in by saying these are universal principles that every actor should adhere to, even whether they're a formal signatory or not. But of course, in the modern concept of asymmetric warfare, where you have smaller, weaker non-state actors trying to gain an advantage over bigger and more powerful state actors, then use of some of these techniques, deception, drawing the state military into very damaging actions on the ground is something that's clearly been consciously deployed by certain non-state actors. So that increases the risk.
Is there anything that can be done to mitigate that risk?
To a certain extent, no. And of course, the consequences are very grave. We've seen, one of the problems in Gaza at the moment, for example, is that there will be probably a temporary cessation of humanitarian operations on the ground in the wake of this particular incident. And of course, the people who lose out from that are the civilians on the ground. To a certain extent, all we can do is try and enforce and improve the electronic, more sophisticated identification of assets on the ground. But if there's deception going on, or if there's a quick decision, human beings are fallible, and the more complex the situation, the more difficult it gets.
So in modern warfare, it really does rely on good and reliable communication.
It does, yeah. That's the bottom line, and it's worth saying that in a lot of cases it can and does work to a certain extent. So an interesting case is the Syrian conflict, for example. So as we know, there was the campaign by the Gulf Coalition militaries against the Houthi rebels on the ground in Yemen. Particularly after 2015 was starting to become a grave concern for all involved, when a high number of civilian assets seemed to be being hit on the ground, whether those were medical facilities or civilian markets and so on. So there was a really big push by all concerned to improve those deconfliction mechanisms at that time, and there's some evidence that that's improved the situation. It doesn't mean Yemen is a great situation, of course, and all conflict is pretty awful, and there's awful things going on, but it can work if everyone is signed up to it, and if there's intense and cooperative sharing of information. But there's always a risk that something will go wrong.
Now, the phrase blue on blue is well known to the forces and beyond. The risk of what is also dubbed a friendly fire attack. Is that deconfliction harder to coordinate when you're working in a multinational alliance, or easier because it is an alliance?
It's of course, the greater the number of actors involved, the potentially harder it gets. Although it's worth noting that the big militaries can fall prey to blue on blue, within their own militaries. We saw in Iraq, particularly, not just the 2003 campaign, but the 1991 campaign as well, that the blue on blue incidents do happen, even when you're all on the same side and working closely in a very integrated alliance. The key is that there's really good understanding between the parties involved and good mechanisms for doing it on a real-time basis.
Professor Julian Richards, good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
News, discussions and analysis. This is Sitrep.
Finally this week, a somewhat different look and sound to Changing the Guard at Buckingham Palace. The band of the Grenadier Guards played the French national anthem as soldiers from F Company Scots Guards in their scarlet tunics and bearskins handed over duties to the Gendarmeries Garde Républicaine, decked out in dark blue. Meanwhile, in Paris... The French Army Choir sang outside the Élysée Palace as soldiers from 7 Company Coldstream Guards joined the Presidential Guard. All this to mark the 120th anniversary of the Entente cordiale. The words literally mean cordial agreement. Let's be nice to each other. Well, Micah, what actually is the Entente cordiale?
Yes, it was an agreement in 1904, which was just a sort of general clearing up of misunderstandings, really. It was tidying up of some colonial boundaries and fisheries issues, and the British agreed that they would leave Morocco to France, and France agreed they would leave Egypt to Britain. And that was really it. It was just a sort of an arrangement, as you say, to be nice to each other. The interesting thing was that in 1907, a similar deal was concluded between Britain and Russia, where they did exactly the same. The British agreed to keep out of northern Persia, and the Russians agreed to keep out of Afghanistan and Tibet, and they tidied up a few other issues. And so you had a triple entente, a British, French, Russian group of entente countries, and everybody said at the time, well, this doesn't mean very much, does it? And while that was taking place, of course, on the centre of Europe, there was a triple alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, a very strong alliance. And, you know, the great irony was that in 1914, when the First World War broke out, the Triple Alliance fell apart. Italy left the alliance and joined the Allies, and Austria-Hungary dragged Germany into a war that the Germans weren't really ready for, whereas the Entente behaved just like an alliance. And it was one of the great ironies that, you know, the Entente sort of functioned like an alliance, and the alliance, the Triple Alliance, functioned like an Entente. It didn't mean very much. One of the great ironies of the way history bent itself in 1914.
And Mike, it's a pretty historic moment. This is the first time non-Commonwealth troops have guarded Buckingham Palace. I imagine it takes something pretty special to get troops from the French Republic to sing positively about royalty at the seat of their very non-royal head of state.
Yes, that was a big moment, actually. And listening to them, they made a pretty good fist of it, I think, singing the national anthem. Thankfully, we were not treated to British guardsmen trying to murder the Marseillaise in response. So I think that was probably diplomatically sensible.
It feels a slightly odd anniversary, though, to be celebrating like this, the 120th.
Yes, it is. I mean, it would make sense to celebrate the 100th or the 150th. The fact that they chose the 120th, which is a nothing anniversary, really, in numerical terms, it shows that sense between Paris and London now that we need to go back to those historical ironies, that the 1904 Entente cordiale turned out to be very important. And we should celebrate what is very important beyond Brexit, beyond the issues that bother us, beyond AUKUS and the sort of the irritations that we have between Paris and London. We should celebrate what more deeply unifies our national interests against common enemies and common challenges. That's what it was really all about.
We arguably have this important defence cooperation treaty with France in the Lancaster House Agreement.
Yes, we do. And I mean, that treaty has been, was very strongly worded, and it never came to very much. And in a way, I think the Entente cordiale celebration is partly based on the idea, well, let's make it mean more. Instead of diverging in our defence procurement and our defence directions, let's try and converge more, because that a very strongly worded treaty was more or less put aside. And when we celebrated the 10th anniversary of that treaty, everyone was scratching their heads, trying to think of good things we could say about it. Well, let's get more of the Entente spirit together and make it mean more than it seemed to mean in the first decade.
And how relevant is this Entente cordiale today? Is it about Ukraine?
It is, yes, and the broader questions that arise from that. And, you know, I think that it is interesting that we've chosen to celebrate it in this way, both Paris and London, because, as I often say, that although history never repeats itself, my goodness, sometimes it rhymes very loudly.
And on that note, thank you, Mike, and thanks to all of our guests. That is all for now. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. Don't forget our full conversation with the Defence Procurement Minister on how he hopes to fix the system is online now. You can watch on the Forces News YouTube channel or listen wherever you get your podcasts. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.